The world economy is a fragile illusion of stability. We wake up every morning, buy our coffee, check our emails, and assume that the complex web of global trade will keep spinning just as it did the day before. We trust that ships will dock, that trucks will run, and that the numbers on our bank screens will hold their value. But history teaches us that this stability is much thinner than we like to admit. It is like a sheet of ice over a dark, deep ocean. And right now, 3 nations are standing on that ice, staring each other down, holding hammers. If a full-scale war were to break out involving the United States, Israel, and Iran, the first explosion would not be on a battlefield. It would be on the financial charts. In a matter of seconds, the comfortable reality we live in would fracture. This is not just about politics or military strategy. This is about your wallet. It is about your job. It is about the price of the food on your table and the gas in your car. To understand what happens next, we have to look past the headlines and look under the hood of the global economic engine. We have to understand how a conflict in a small slice of the Middle East can trigger a financial heart attack that is felt in Kansas, in London, in Tokyo, and in Sao Paulo. Imagine it is a Tuesday morning. News breaks that a direct military confrontation has begun. Missiles are flying. But the real weapon of mass destruction in this scenario is geography. Specifically, a narrow strip of water known as the Strait of Hormuz. This strait is the jugular vein of the world economy. It is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. On one side is Iran. On the other is Oman. Through this tiny channel flows roughly 20 to 30% of the world's totally consumed liquid petroleum. That is over 20 million barrels of oil every single day. It is the most critical choke point on planet Earth. In the event of a total war, military analysts and economic strategists agree on one terrifying probability. Iran could attempt to close the strait. They could use naval mines, fast attack boats, and shore-based missile batteries to make the water impassable for commercial tankers. The moment that happens, the global supply of energy is effectively decapitated. We need to pause here and understand what an oil shock looks like in the modern age. We often think we have moved past our reliance on oil because we see electric cars on the road and solar panels on roofs. But that is a pleasant fiction. The global economy still runs on oil. It is the master commodity. It is the blood in the veins of commerce. When the Strait of Hormuz closes, the price of oil does not just go up. It goes vertical. We are not talking about gas prices rising by 50 cents. We are talking about oil prices doubling or even tripling overnight. JP Morgan and other major financial institutions have run simulations on this. Some project oil hitting $150 a barrel. Others say it could breach $200 or more. Let us walk through the immediate consequences of $200 oil. The first place you feel it is at the pump. But that is actually the least of your worries. The real problem is that energy is an input cost for everything else. Think about a loaf of bread. To make that bread, a farmer needs fertilizer. Fertilizer is made using natural gas and petroleum byproducts. The tractor that harvests the wheat runs on diesel. The truck that carries the wheat to the factory runs on diesel. The factory that bakes the bread uses massive amounts of electricity. The plastic bag the bread is wrapped in is made from oil. The truck that delivers the bread to your grocery store runs on diesel. When the price of oil triples, the cost of every single step in that chain explodes. This is what economists call cost-push inflation. It is the nastiest kind of inflation because it is not caused by people having too much money. It is caused by a scarcity of the things we need to survive. Suddenly, businesses are facing a nightmare scenario. Their costs are skyrocketing, but their customers are panicking. Airlines would be the first to bleed. Jet fuel is their biggest expense. With oil at $200, ticket prices would have to double to keep planes in the air. Most people would simply stop flying. The tourism industry, which supports millions of jobs worldwide, would grind to a halt. Logistics companies like FedEx, UPS, and Amazon rely entirely on cheap fuel to move packages. If their costs double, they pass that on to you. If you stop buying because shipping is too expensive, they start laying off workers. It creates a domino effect. But let us go deeper. The economic devastation of a war involving Iran, Israel, and the United States goes far beyond the price of gas. It triggers a crisis in the financial plumbing of the world. The moment the first shot is fired, the financial markets will react with blind panic. Modern markets are driven by algorithms. These are computer programs designed to sell risk assets the nanosecond they detect uncertainty. we would likely see a massive sell-off in the stock market. Trillions of dollars in paper wealth could evaporate in days. This is what is known as a risk-off event. Investors do not want to own tech stocks or real estate when the world is on fire. They want safety. They want assets that cannot go bankrupt. Historically, this means two things: gold and United States Treasury bonds. Gold prices would soar as people lose faith in paper currency. But the rush into U.S. Treasury bonds creates a strange paradox. Even though the United States would be a participant in the war, the U.S. dollar is still the world's reserve currency. When people are scared, they buy dollars. This causes the value of the U.S. dollar to skyrocket against other currencies. You might think a strong dollar is good for Americans. In a vacuum, maybe. But in a global crisis, a super strong dollar is a wrecking ball. Developing nations borrow money in dollars. When the dollar gets stronger, their debt gets more expensive. Countries in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia could face immediate default. Their economies would collapse as they can no longer afford to pay back their loans or import food and energy. We would see a wave of sovereign debt crises that would make the 2008 financial crisis look like a dress rehearsal. Now consider the position of the Federal Reserve. The Central Bank of the United States would be trapped in an impossible dilemma. This is the nightmare scenario that keeps central bankers awake at night. On one hand, the war is causing massive inflation through energy prices. The textbook response to inflation is to raise interest rates to cool the economy down. On the other hand, the shock of the war is causing the economy to crash. Consumer spending is drying up. Businesses are freezing. The textbook response to a crashing economy is to cut interest rates to stimulate growth. So what does the Federal Reserve do? If they raise rates to fight the oil inflation, they crush the economy and cause a massive recession. If they cut rates to save the economy, they let inflation run wild, destroying the value of savings and wages. This situation is called stagflation. It is a stagnant economy combined with high inflation. It is the economic equivalent of being suffocated and drowned at the same time. The last time we saw this on a major scale was in the 1970s, which was also triggered by conflict in the Middle East. It took a decade of pain to fix. A new war could bring stagflation back with a vengeance, but this time in a world that is much more indebted and fragile than it was 50 years ago. We must also look at the fiscal cost. War is incredibly expensive. Modern warfare burns through money faster than it burns through fuel. The United States is already running significant budget deficits. The national debt is at historical highs. In a full-scale conflict with Iran, the U.S. military would need to deploy carrier strike groups, air wings, and potentially ground support. We are talking about billions of dollars a week. Where does this money come from? It does not exist in a vault somewhere. It has to be borrowed. The U.S. government would have to issue massive amounts of new debt. Usually countries like China or Japan buy this debt. But in a polarized geopolitical world, who buys the bonds? If the world is fractured, the Federal Reserve might have to step in and print the money to fund the war. Printing money to fund a war while inflation is already high is like pouring gasoline on a fire to put it out. It devalues the currency further. It is a hidden tax on every citizen. You pay for the war not just through taxes, but through the fact that your paycheck buys less every month. The purchasing power of the middle class would be eroded to finance the conflict. Let us widen the lens to the global supply chain. It is not just the Strait of Hormuz that is at risk. We have already seen how regional militias can disrupt shipping in the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is the highway for goods moving between Europe and Asia. If a war spreads, the entire region becomes a no-go zone for commercial shipping. Insurance companies are the unseen gatekeepers of global trade. No ship moves without insurance. If the risk of war is too high, insurers will simply refuse to cover ships traveling through the Middle East. This means ships have to take the long way around Africa, past the Cape of Good Hope. This adds weeks to delivery times and massive fuel costs. It breaks the just-in-time supply chain that modern manufacturing relies on. Factories in Germany that need parts from China will stop running. Assembly lines in Texas that need components from Taiwan will go silent. We saw during the pandemic how fragile these supply chains are. A war would shatter them completely. We would see shortages of everything from electronics to pharmaceuticals. This brings us to a critical player we have not mentioned yet. China. China is the world's largest importer of oil. A huge portion of that oil comes from the Persian Gulf. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed, the Chinese economy faces an existential threat. Their factories would starve for energy. This creates a dangerous geopolitical feedback loop. A collapsing Chinese economy is bad for everyone. They are the factory of the world. If China stops making things, the world stops buying things. Furthermore, an energy-starved China might feel compelled to intervene. They might deepen their alliance with Russia to secure overland oil supplies, further dividing the world into opposing economic blocs. We are looking at the potential end of globalization as we know it. For 30 years, the world has operated on the premise of open trade and integrated markets. A war of this magnitude forces countries to pick sides. It forces nations to become protectionist. They hoard resources. They ban exports of food and critical minerals. We would see a fragmentation of the global economy into isolated fortresses. Let us bring this back to the human level. What does this look like for a family living in a suburb in America or an apartment in London? It starts with uncertainty. You watch the news and feel a knot in your stomach. Then you go to the gas station and see the price has jumped $2 since yesterday. You hesitate to fill the tank. Then you go to the grocery store. You notice that certain shelves are empty because the trucks are delayed or the imports have stopped. The fresh produce is twice as expensive because of the transport costs. Then you check your retirement account or your investment portfolio. It is down 20%. The down payment you were saving for a house is suddenly worth much less. The interest rates on mortgages have spiked because of the chaos in the bond market, so buying a house becomes impossible. Your employer calls a meeting. Because supply costs are up and customers are scared, they are freezing hiring. Maybe they are cutting hours. The job security you took for granted is gone. This is the insidious nature of economic warfare. It does not destroy buildings in your neighborhood. It destroys your future. It destroys your ability to plan. It steals the value of your labor. There is also the psychological toll. Consumer confidence is a self-fulfilling prophecy. When people believe the economy will get worse, they stop spending. When they stop spending, the economy gets worse. War creates a psychology of fear. It makes people hoard cash. It freezes the flow of money. We must also consider the long-term structural changes. A war like this would force a rapid and painful acceleration of the energy transition. Europe and Asia would realize they cannot rely on Middle Eastern oil. They would pour trillions into nuclear, solar, and wind, not just for the environment, but for national survival. This sounds like a silver lining, but the transition period would be brutal. You cannot build a nuclear plant in a month. In the interim years, the standard of living would drop as energy remains scarce and expensive. We would see energy rationing. Governments telling you when you can turn on your heat or how much you can drive. There is a historical precedent for this. During the 1973 oil crisis, the United Kingdom had to implement the 3-day week. Commercial users of electricity were limited to 3 consecutive days of consumption each week. Television broadcasts stopped at 10:30 p.m. to save electricity. The U.S. imposed a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour to save gas. We think of these things as ancient history, but the economic mechanics that caused them are still in place. Furthermore, we need to talk about the cyber dimension. A modern war is not just fought with missiles. It is fought with code. Iran has a sophisticated cyber warfare capability. In the event of a conflict, they would likely target U.S. infrastructure. Imagine if the banking system was hit. Imagine if the power grid in major cities was compromised. The economic damage of a cyber attack on the financial sector could be incalculable. If payment processing systems go down for even a day, commerce stops. If you cannot swipe your card, you cannot buy food. The velocity of money hits zero. This vulnerability adds a layer of risk that did not exist in 1973. Our economy is entirely digital. It relies on the internet and electricity. If those are targeted, the chaos is immediate. Now let us look at the specific impact on the housing market. Real estate is sensitive to interest rates and sentiment. In a high inflation, high interest rate environment caused by war, the housing market freezes. Sellers do not want to sell because they have nowhere to go. Buyers cannot buy because mortgages are unaffordable. Construction would halt. Builders cannot budget for materials when prices are changing every day. This exacerbates the housing shortage. We would see a generation of young people locked out of homeownership for years, deepening the wealth gap. The wealth gap is another casualty of war. Inflation hurts the poor the most. The wealthy have assets that tend to rise with inflation, like real estate or gold. They have access to financial instruments to hedge their risk. The working class has wages, and wages rarely keep up with hyperinflation. So, a war would likely result in a massive transfer of wealth. The middle class would shrink. The poor would become destitute. The social fabric would strain. We often see civil unrest follow periods of high food and energy prices. It happened in the Arab Spring. It could happen in Western nations too if the economic pressure becomes too great. Let us return to the Strait of Hormuz for a moment to understand the difficulty of fixing this. You might ask, why cannot the U.S. Navy just reopen the strait? They can eventually. But it takes time. Clearing mines is slow, dangerous work. While the mines are being cleared, the insurance rates remain sky high. The oil does not flow. And even if the strait is reopened, the infrastructure might be damaged. Oil refineries, pipelines, and loading terminals are large, stationary targets. If they are destroyed, they take years to rebuild. We could be looking at a structural deficit in energy supply that lasts for a decade. This creates a scenario known as demand destruction. Eventually, the price of oil falls, but only because the global economy has collapsed so badly that no one needs oil anymore because factories are closed and people are unemployed. That is not a victory. That is a depression. We also have to consider the opportunity cost. Every dollar spent on war, and every dollar lost to economic chaos, is a dollar not spent on education, on healthcare, on infrastructure, on science. A war of this magnitude sets humanity back. It diverts our collective resources away from progress and toward destruction and survival. The semiconductor industry is another flashpoint. While not located in the Middle East, the industry relies on complex global logistics. Israel itself is a significant hub for technology and chip design. Disruption there ripples through Silicon Valley. Intel, Nvidia, and other giants have deep ties to the region. A disruption in the tech sector drags down the stock market indices, which are heavily weighted toward big tech. Let us synthesize all these moving parts. The war starts. The Strait of Hormuz closes. Oil hits $200. Gas prices double. Transport costs soar. Food prices spike. Inflation returns to double digits. Central banks are paralyzed. Interest rates stay high. Stock markets crash. Housing markets freeze. Unemployment rises as businesses cut costs. Government debt explodes. Global trade routes fracture. Developing nations default. It is a bleak picture, but it is a necessary one to paint because it highlights a fundamental truth about our modern world. Economics is the study of how we allocate scarce resources. War is the ultimate destroyer of resources. In the past, wars were sometimes seen as good for the economy because they boosted manufacturing. That was true in World War II, when the U.S. had massive idle capacity and was emerging from the Great Depression. It is not true today. Today, our economy is supply-constrained and debt-laden. We cannot afford a war. The system is too tight. There is no slack in the rope. The lesson here is that peace is not just a humanitarian ideal. It is an economic imperative. The prosperity we enjoy is built on a foundation of relative stability. When we shake that foundation, the house of cards can fall very quickly. For the ordinary person, this analysis serves as a wake-up call. It suggests that resilience is key. Financial resilience means having savings. It means not being over-leveraged with debt. It means understanding that the low-inflation, low-interest rate world we lived in for the last decade was an anomaly, not the rule. It also teaches us to pay attention to the world map. We cannot ignore foreign policy as something that happens over there. In a globalized economy, there is no over there. Everything is here. A mine in the water off the coast of Iran is a hole in the pocket of a worker in Detroit. As we look at the rising tensions in the world, we have to respect the interconnectedness of our reality. The economy is a living organism. You cannot cut off a limb and expect the heart to keep beating without struggle. A conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran would be a tragedy of human life first and foremost. But the second tragedy would be the unraveling of the economic progress of the last generation. It would be a great reset, but not the kind anyone wants. It would be a reset to a harder, poorer, more volatile world. The numbers on the stock ticker are just lights on a screen, but they represent our ability to feed our families, heat our homes, and build our lives. Protecting that stability requires wisdom, diplomacy, and a clear-eyed understanding of the costs. Because the bill for this kind of war is one that we would all be paying for the rest of our lives. The story of the economy is usually written in the slow language of growth and trade. But sometimes it is written in the fast, violent language of shock. We are standing on the precipice of such a chapter. Understanding the mechanics of that shock is the first step in navigating it. We must hope that the leaders of the world understand it too. Because once the first domino falls, the laws of economics take over, and they are unforgiving. We often talk about the economy as if it were a machine that we can tune and fix. But it is more like an ecosystem. It relies on trust. It relies on the belief that tomorrow will be predictable. War destroys that trust. It replaces prediction with chaos. If we look back at the 1973 crisis, the world eventually recovered. But it changed. It changed how we build cars. It changed how we heat homes. It changed politics. A new conflict would change us again. It would likely accelerate the end of the oil age, but through pain rather than planning. It would also likely reshape the global financial order. If the US dollar is weaponized through sanctions and war, other nations will accelerate their efforts to create alternative payment systems. We could see the rise of a parallel financial system led by the BRICS nations, further bifurcating the global economy. This reduces efficiency and increases costs for everyone. The interconnectedness that has made goods cheap and abundant for the last 30 years is the same interconnectedness that makes us vulnerable now. We optimized for efficiency, not for resilience. We built a race car, not an off-road vehicle. And now we are driving onto a rocky road. So when you see headlines about escalating tensions, do not just scroll past. Think about the supply chain. Think about the energy markets. Think about the invisible threads that tie your daily life to the geopolitics of the Middle East. The economy is not separate from history. It is the engine of history. And right now, that engine is revving in the red zone. The hope is that cooler heads prevail. But hope is not a strategy. Understanding the risk is the only way to be prepared for the consequences. In the end, the true cost of war is not measured in dollars spent on missiles. It is measured in the lost potential of the human race. It is measured in the businesses that were never started, the houses that were never built, and the prosperity that was never realized because the resources were consumed by conflict. That is the invisible graveyard of economic war. And it is a graveyard we should fight very hard to avoid filling. The world is small. The economy is tight. And the stakes have never been higher. This is the reality of our time. It is a story still being written, and we are all characters in it. Let us hope for a boring chapter ahead. Because in economics, boring is good. Boring is food on the table. Boring is a steady job. Boring is peace. And right now, boring is the most valuable commodity on earth.